Hello, good evening, and welcome to Tools for Success, How to Communicate in the Teenage Years. I'm incredibly excited that you all are joining us, and I'm really looking forward to the great content that we have planned for you all tonight. My name is Katie Gomel-Kywitz. I work in the admissions office here at the Bear Creek School, and I will also be your MC for the event this evening. I'd like to make a couple announcements before getting started with the talk. The first is that there will be a Q&A time at the end, and so I would love it if you all could ask your questions. There should be a box on your screen for Q&A. So throughout the presentation tonight, please feel free to type questions into that box, and then we'll get to as many as we can at the end. The second thing that I would love to do is share with you all a great video from our head of school, Patrick Kruth, sharing a little bit more about the vision and mission of the Bear Creek School.
So I recall sitting in my high school geometry class asking myself, why in the world do I need to know the Pythagorean theorem? You may have had a similar experience in your high school geometry class, and the reason for that is because we are the inheritors of a very ancient way of doing education known as the liberal arts. The Greeks and Romans invented this way of educating. They had two parts, the trivium and the quadrivium, the trivium being grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium being arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And the point of all of that was to teach students language, to have them engage language, to teach them to read great stories of great people, to shape them, and then to expose them to the sciences and to the arts and send them off to change the world. I'm asked all the time about what's more important, technology or a liberal arts education, and I think that shows a misunderstanding about what a Christian liberal arts education is. See, in reality, it's not either or, but it's both. We are people who have minds, we are people who have hearts, and we are people who have hands. And what a Christian liberal arts education actually promises is to know not just what to do and not just how to do, but whether one ought to do it. You see, while true education does aim at the mind and at the heart, true education can only happen after the heart has been changed. Christ changes our heart so that we might know him and then might know his world properly. So Christian liberal arts education completes what the Greeks and the Romans started by changing the heart first and then changing the mind so students might live lives of wisdom, compassion, and courage. At the Bear Creek School, we're trying to do that, to create students who are wise, compassionate, and courageous, who have the goods of the mind to be able to engage the world, but who also love their neighbor as themselves and have the courage to step out and to make a difference in the world. As you've already heard, graduates, we implore you, be heroic, live courageously, and make a difference in the world. Always remember, fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten.
We wanted to start out with that video for our event tonight because so many of those themes and important ideas about a Bear Creek education have really been elevated and heightened during this COVID season of our life. And the idea of technology and communication, I certainly don't need to tell you all, is paramount right now as we work through digital learning and as you are remote tonight with us on the screen. So the topic for tonight about communication and communicating in the teenage years is incredibly timely, and we're fortunate to have the wisdom of two fantastic speakers who will share with us not just about digital communication, but also the importance of that personal face-to-face communication as well. So with that said, I would love to introduce our first speaker for tonight. Nathan Pettit is a devoted husband and father who lives in Redmond with his wife and two sons. As the early middle school and middle school dean of students, Nathan works with faculty, staff, and students to develop, implement, and oversee programs, events, and activities that enhance the faith, community, and character of the students. And I have to say, during COVID, he has been incredibly creative with some fun, safe, and socially distanced activities for our students. In addition to enjoying time with his family, Nathan loves to grab a cup of coffee and read books related to theology, psychology, technology, and historical fiction. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Nathan, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Katie, for that. I appreciate that. and takes care of a lot of what I need to say at the beginning in introducing myself. And I just want to say good evening to everyone, and thank you for coming, and thank you for making time to take part in this important conversation. As Katie mentioned, my wife and I have 2 kids, 2 little boys, and probably within the next month we'll have our third, a little girl as well, who we're really excited to welcome into our family. This is my 6th year at Bear Creek. I taught Latin for my first few years before stepping into this current position as Dean of Students to both early middle school and middle school students. And as I really step into this conversation about communication and technology, I sort of come at it from 2 perspectives. One is that I have really young children, right? And so I'm thinking and researching and reading a lot about what those foundational principles are, and how to develop them and how to nurture them in my little boys, and how to give them an aptitude and an appetite for face-to-face conversations and the empathetic arts that come through face-to-face conversation. Juxtaposing with that is just all the work I've got to do with teens and college students over the years, really since I graduated from college a little over 10 years ago. That's been a big part of my life, being a teacher, a coach, and administrator. And so I love this topic for all those reasons. As I began this journey, really to think more and to read and to study more about the intersections between technology and conversation, it started with a conversation with a friend a few years ago, where I had expressed my frustration with the amount of time I was spending on my phone. And what he did in that moment is he handed me a book entitled The Shallows: What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains by Nicholas Carr. And so when I read that book a few years ago, Carr was really the first person who introduced me to concepts such as the plasticity of our brains, neuroplasticity, the function of the neurotransmitters that fire and synapse in our brains, and the effects of the internet on our capacities for things like concentration and contemplation. So that really whet my appetite. I began hunting for more books that examined the relationships between things like digital media in the brain, as well as books that examined the intersections of things between technology and relationships and human development. And those ideas I sort of put together with some other categories that Katie mentioned that I already was reading in, like philosophy and the philosophy of behavior change, and the formative practices which really shape who we are as people, that shape our desires and our aims and our pursuits in life. And so all of that has kind of been my journey over these last few years, and then just the platform, here at Bear Creek, to have candid conversations with kids and hear about the ways that they use their phones and what they're facing, what they love about it, what they don't like about it, and how that kind of just shapes and colors the atmosphere that they're living in, which is a little different, obviously, than the ones I grew up in. As somebody who got my first phone at age 15, it was a very dumb phone at that. So amidst all those books, I'll recommend a few during this time. One of my hopes as I launch into this is that what I share today isn't characterized at all as anti-tech, and Mr. Kruth really spoke that well in the video you all saw. I have no intention of calling technology evil or throwing any stones at the way anybody uses technology. And I'm just as guilty as anybody else of mismanaging my phone from time to time, probably on a daily basis. But if our goal here tonight is to discuss how to communicate in the teenage years, we have to get real about a few things. First, why uninterrupted, intimate conversation is so crucial to all of our well-being and the health of our relationships. Second, why some foundational conditions for having meaningful conversations and why those conditions are so difficult to maintain from time to time, and what we can do about it. My final preface: as we step into the challenges related to technology, I just want to acknowledge and just the difficulty of living amidst screens, and how a lot of our lives have been forced into screens over the last several months. And I recognize that as parents, we've all had to make some concessions about how we use screens and how screens are used in our homes. I think it's just become harder and harder, right, to nurture the kind of environment and to nurture the kind of activities that support the growth we'd like to see in our children. So if anything I say, just makes you feel like, that's me too, or I struggle with that, I also want you to have grace, a lot of grace for yourself. I think that's really important as we navigate this time right now together. I want to share a little bit about the earliest memory I have of a conversation, and it wasn't exactly a happy one. One afternoon, 5-year-old me was in line at the grocery store, and I asked my mom to get a roll of mints, and she said no. Now, I know she would say this too. She would agree with this. I was a really agreeable little kid. I mean, I wanted to please my parents. I usually wanted to do the right thing. But in that moment, for whatever reason, with hardly a second thought, instead of putting the mints back on the shelf, I stuffed them into my pocket. So fast forward to later that evening, my sister and I are running around the home, jumping on and off the fireplace, and I'm making pit stops into my room to pop another mint in my mouth. And amidst all of the chaos, I actually had the boldness, the audacity to walk over to my mom and share how good my breath was because of how I brushed my teeth. However, I think that was really the straw that broke the camel's back. Minutes after that, just the weight of my actions struck me, and pangs of guilt just began raging in my stomach as a little kid. So I knew what I had to do, and I recall hesitating a couple times before finally breaking down and confessing everything to my mom. And when I look back, I think I was afraid of telling her, not because I thought that she would be angry, but because I knew she'd be disappointed in the decision I made. And so we sat down on the couch. I really do remember it to this day. And we had a conversation about my decision and its underlying motivations and the kind of person that I wanted to be and the kind of person that she saw me as. Then later the next day, I had to go back to the store and apologize to the store manager and return those mints. From that event, I mean, I learned so much about taking responsibility for my actions and the severity of theft, obviously. But even more than that, what I want to recognize for the purpose of this conversation is that moment, that interaction, that exchange with my mom, in that time that we spoke, she demonstrated the crucial, important skills of empathy and compassion to me. And in so doing was teaching me as a 5-year-old how to do the same myself. Furthermore, she taught me that in our family, it was safe to be honest and it was safe to be authentic, that our home was a place not where I was expected to perform, but where I knew I could be loved. My childhood experience aligns with Sherry Turkle's research on face-to-face conversation. Turkle is a professor of the social sciences, social studies of science and technology at MIT. She's trained as a sociologist, she's a licensed clinical psychologist, and has spent over 30 years studying the psychology of people's relationships with technology. She has a lot of stuff to say. I've read a couple of her books, and they're fun to read. In her best-selling book, Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in a Digital Age, she writes, "Face-to-face conversation is the most human and humanizing thing we do. Fully present to one another, we learn to listen. It's where we develop the capacity for empathy. It's where we experience the joy of being heard, of being understood. In conversation advances self-reflection, the conversations with ourselves that are the cornerstone of early development and continue throughout our life." So later on in her book, Turkle juxtaposes that with this. She says, "More time on screens and less time in conversation means lost practice in the empathetic arts, learning to make eye contact, to listen, and to attend to others. Conversation is the path toward the experience of intimacy, community, and communion, and reclaiming conversation is a step forward toward reclaiming our most fundamental human values." So you're probably going to hear me say this a few times. I'm not trying to indicate at all that we should throw away our phones, lest we miss an important conversation that our children are ready to have. However, I also have to say, I can never know if in that moment as a 5-year-old, when I was ready, when I had worked up the courage to tell my mom what happened, what I did, if she had said, "Wait another minute while I finish this email," I'm just not positive that I would have maintained the courage to admit what happened, or if that would have fled away and I would have just buried it. So saying that, one of the most foundational conditions for generating meaningful conversation that I want to emphasize tonight, I want to emphasize a couple, and for nurturing deep relationships, for communicating, is our attention. And it's important to understand that there is a war on our attention. Because whether you're a teen or an adult, if you have a phone on your person, the people around you must compete with it for your eyes and for your ears. I felt this really deeply actually a couple weeks ago, a couple Sundays ago, when sharing a moment with my oldest son. By some miracle, a couple weeks ago, the sun came out and it stopped raining. And so our online church had ended and we dashed outside to go ride our bikes together. He's 4.5. A couple blocks away from our home, we stopped to throw rocks in the nearby pond. And he loves doing that. He'll take like a bunch of rocks together and throw them and watch them all splash. And then what he really likes to do though is find big rocks and throw them high up into the air to see how big of a splash he can make. So we were throwing our rocks high up into the air to create those big splashes. I remember just the sun was so bright. It just felt special, I think, because it hadn't been out in a while. So I knew in that moment that we were just sharing a moment. We were sharing a special time. And it was one that we just hadn't had in a while, being outside together in the warmth of the sun. And then it hit me. Amidst that shared moment, fantasy football started creeping into my mind. I hadn't checked my team score in about 20 minutes, and a lot can happen in that time. People talk about social scientists and those who study social media and the effects on the brain talk about checking your likes on Instagram, kind of like pulling the slot machine, because you don't know in that moment how many likes you're going to have or who's going to comment. And for me, fantasy football has that same effect. The changing scores, the rush of wanting to win, the game. I realize I'm talking about something that's totally out of my control, people who are playing football, and I have nothing to do with it, but that's what happens. And for my team, after a rough few weeks, my team had made a comeback, and I made the playoffs. Out of 16 teams, the top 4 played for the championship, and 5th through 8th played for the consolation championship, and I just made it into the consolation playoff, and then 2 weeks ago played for the consolation championship. So when my son wasn't looking, I pulled my phone out of my pocket to take a quick look. And, the synapses in my brain are firing, the dopamine's flooding from the anticipation and the thrill. And in that moment, as I'm staring at my phone, my son yells excitedly. He was just so jazzed about the huge rock he had landed and the big splash it made. And I completely missed it. And I get it. Pretending I can see your faces out there at home. I know it's not like I just missed his first steps, right? It wasn't that big. Although I will say I may have watched his first steps through the camera lens of my phone while recording it. I don't recall exactly. So that's real, but it wasn't his first steps. It was a rock in the water, right? But what are our lives if not a collection of ordinary moments, right? When I grow old and look back on my life, I don't expect to cherish or probably even remember any of my finishes in fantasy football. And I won a couple weeks ago, just to let you know too. I do expect, however, to cherish the relationships I have with my children and all of the ordinary moments that they were built on. So I'm going to say it again. The point isn't that screens are bad and that we should never look at them. But one reality we must grapple with as children, as teens, and as parents is that many of the things we use our phones for prey on our human vulnerabilities. In that moment, yeah, sure. It's fantasy football, but part of what I craved was the thrill, the curiosity of checking my score and seeing what had happened and what I had missed. As humans, we love things like instant social connection, high stimulation, and constant entertainment. And the fabric of things like both fantasy football and things like social media, they're structured to utilize those human vulnerabilities and wield them to gain and hold our attention for as long as possible. And you've probably heard it, if you've watched any kind of documentary about it or read books, but many software engineers are out there explaining that if the service we're using on our phone is free, it's because ultimately we are the product, not it, right? And the companies that make those products are paid by advertisers because our attention is in high demand. Again, I'm not villainizing any of that. I'm just saying that's the reality that we're working with. And if the quiet and almost imperceptible pull of digital media weren't enough for us to manage and distract our attention, most of us also happen to carry our devices wherever we go, giving us access to those things at any time we want. And I think it's important just to recognize and just to get out there how novel actually that is. So another book I really have appreciated over the years is a book called Digital Minimalism, Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World by Cal Newport. Newport is an associate professor of computer science at Georgetown, and he takes us back a few years in his book before we had access to just instant everything. Newport reminds his readers about the once novelty of Sony's Walkman. And maybe you remember, I had my own pair. I don't remember how I was, maybe 11 or 12. Those foam headphones that went over your head and stuck out here, and the Walkman that accompanied it. But later on after that, you know, and those things were probably cool in their own right, but you didn't necessarily see them everywhere. At least I didn't as a kid. So later on, Apple develops these really thin and slim iPods with these sleek white earbuds, right? And you may not have found a whole lot of people, you know, rocking the Sony Walkman down the street, but you would find more and more people with their iPod, you know, earbuds plugged in. And what Apple did is they kind of gave us a convenient and cool way to tune out our environments and to provide a musical backdrop to our entire day, to anything we wanted to do. And yet even still, Newport reminds us it probably would have been a little awkward and socially, you know, out there to pop in your earbuds while you did things like wait for your name to be called in the dentist office. Probably would have been a little rude, right? But not anymore. Thanks to what Newport has coined the quick glance. So with our phones in hand, we can escape from our current surroundings, even if we only have a moment to spare. Heaven forbid, and I'm looking at myself, not just at the screen, although I am looking at myself in my screen. That's probably not funny at all. But heaven forbid we just sit at a red light when our texts and emails and social media updates are just a quick glance away, right? And I don't know about you, but I am such a hypocrite because I did that a couple of days ago at a red light, glanced at a text. But if I'm in a rush in the car and I can tell somebody's doing that when the light turns green, I'm so irritated by it. But that's the world we live in. Unfortunately now, pertaining to this conversation, conversations are now fair game. Recent surveys report that 89% of Americans say they interrupted their last social interaction to turn to their phones. And 82% say that the conversation suffered for it. Furthermore, studies show that if two people are having lunch, even just a cell phone at the table, it could be turned down, but a cell phone at the table steers conversation to lighter subjects, and each party feels less invested in each other. And it's not surprising if we think about it, because we've probably all been interrupted before. Each person in a conversation knows that when a phone's around, subconsciously even, you could be interrupted at any time. And when I talk to a lot of teens about this, they acknowledge that it's sad, it's frustrating, and it kind of hurts that if they're talking to a friend, that friend turns to their phone and looks. But even though that bothers them, most of them believe that it's just sort of the world we live in, and there's not a whole lot they can do about it. We have a lot of excuses, you know, for these habits, and maybe one of the chief ones is just that if we have a free moment, we might feel a little bored, or we just want to look right at our phone. But I think the reason we find ourselves bored might be because we have become just more and more accustomed to a constant feed of connection, information, and entertainment, and our brains and our bodies and our hearts learn to crave it as a result. And again, it's rooted in the reality that we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable people who long to be recognized and heard and loved. And what social media offers us and what our phones offer us is an opportunity at any moment, at any time, to connect with somebody, that somebody's out there to connect with. One teen I spoke with a couple of years ago has told me that when he's on Snapchat and active in it, a new snap comes in about every 3 seconds. So the constant social media connection just is vast. It's constant. The problem, though, is that when we allow our devices to meet some of those needs for connection, for our identity, for being recognized and heard, more and more we start looking at our phones, and less do we start expecting from each other. So in her work, Turkle emphasizes this problem by saying something that struck me when I read it. She said that being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. And she says that listening, real listening, takes patience and attention. It means we must be fully present in the moment. It might necessitate even that we persevere through some awkward silences or some uninteresting topics. Near the end of her book, she says, she calls it like the rule of 7, that sometimes it takes like 7 minutes really to get deep enough into a conversation where something meaningful is happening. And in those 7 minutes, you might actually move through a lot of awkward silences and boredom. But the more and more we train ourselves for relationship through digital media, the more we crave that feed of connection and information and entertainment that really just isn't possible in face-to-face conversation. We find that the modes of communication provided by texting and even things like email are no longer just the kind of communication we enjoy, but actually the kind of communication that we prefer. And more teens report actually feeling uncomfortable and anxious in face-to-face conversation. I felt this way at certain moments where I would rather have a conversation with somebody through email than face-to-face or over the phone. And what they say is that unlike real life conversation, our devices provide us with a world where we can edit our words and our images. They allow us to control the version of ourselves that we want to present. And so there's just less risk in saying something wrong or in looking foolish. So our attention is vital. It's a vital foundation to this communication thing and the depth of our relationships that we want to pursue. But Newport's quick glance idea that he teaches us, it teaches us another important condition for meaningful conversation that can be hindered by the ubiquity of screens. And that's that many of us are deprived of solitude. On more than one occasion, as a kid, my parents navigated my childhood questions with a lot of patience and graciousness. From questions like, where do babies come from, to what happens when you die. It's interesting, though, to note that so many of those conversations were asked actually in the same place, and that was our car. So in a childhood like mine, a ride in the car meant that I had to leave my Nintendo 64, away at home, any television I was watching, any games that I was playing, my friends, and it usually just meant time alone with my thoughts. And studies report that solitude, so the state in which your mind is just free from other minds, it doesn't mean you have to take a wilderness walk or vacation, but just that your mind is free from the input of other people and other ideas, that it provides innumerable benefits, including things like the ability to clarify hard problems. We learn to regulate our emotions, we build moral courage, and our relationships are strengthened. Other studies link solitude to increased empathy and resilience and creativity and a stronger sense of self. So in regard to our relationships, when we find time alone to clarify our thoughts and to understand our emotions, we actually gain rich material to bring to our next conversation. And foundationally, when we know who we are, we're ready to bring ourselves, our whole selves, into relationships and into communication. On the flip side, when we're afraid of being alone, when we struggle to pay attention to ourselves, what suffers is our ability to pay attention to each other. One benefit many teens find in their phones, and they've told me this a lot, and you see it in some of the testimonials in a lot of these books, is that they love having a constant lifeline when their friends feel bored or sad or upset. And many teens actually insist on sleeping with their phones in their bed just in case somebody needs to reach them. The problem, though, of course, is if we don't turn inward at least some of the time, we never learn how to navigate those emotions ourselves, and we never build up the resilience to endure them ourselves. And so Turkle states again, if we don't know the satisfactions of solitude, we only know the panic of loneliness. And she tells a lot of stories, even of adults who tried to take breaks away from their phones, breaks away from screens, and a panic set in about 2 or 3 hours into that phone fast, and they felt just the need to be able to get a hold of somebody if they needed to, or the fear that somebody might be trying to get a hold of them and they weren't around to answer that. Newport calls this extreme lack of time alone with your thoughts solitude deprivation, and he writes this that these people who are really deprived of solitude have lost the ability to process and make sense of their emotions, or to reflect on who they are and what really matters, or to build strong relationships, or even just to allow their brains time to just power down and to power down those critical social circuits that we use all the time. And they're just not meant to be used constantly. And when we can power down and when we can have moments of solitude, it allows us to redirect that energy to other important housekeeping tasks. He says later, simply put, humans are not wired to be constantly wired. So those are the two big ideas I have, just these two foundational conditions to having good communication in our home, to having fruitful, meaningful conversation, and to having deeper relationships is more attention to our attention and to moments of solitude. And obviously with this talk, it's been on my mind a lot, and even still, I struggle. I struggle when my wife starts talking to me. Sometimes I treat it, I think, more like information exchange. So she's telling me something that she wants me to know, and as I'm looking at my phone or my computer, I'm hearing what she's saying and I'm processing it, because I sometimes view that relationship as just an exchange of ideas or an exchange of information. And what she's really looking for, and she is willing, I'm thankful to tell me, is to communicate with me, to talk, to connect, to be present with one another. And it's just tough unless we have boundaries around when and where we use our phones. And so I'd like to talk about just a couple ways we can nurture our aptitude for slowing down, for being attentive to one another, and for enjoying solitude. And I want to reiterate one more time too, I fully recognize we're all in a global pandemic together, and I just want you to have grace for yourself in the many ways that this last year may have affected your home environments and in ways that you wouldn't prefer. I've been thinking as well that just technology moves much faster than we can keep up with. And this constant stream of decisions that we all as parents have to make about what our kids watch and play and engage with online is just unprecedented. There's decisions all the time, right? Because there's new things happening all the time, and we have to discern whether those support our family values or detract from them. And it's just really hard to keep up with all of that. So I just want you to know, if you're here, you're doing a wonderful job. I know that you are, and just the fact that you would stop by to participate in this conversation, I think demonstrates that. But if you feel compelled just to act on any of this, I just would say just take one small step that would encourage deeper relationships and more meaningful conversation, something I think that you can be consistent in. And so here's 3 suggestions to get you started. One is just to identify sacred spaces for device-free conversation. I think even those of us who might feel like we have a high aptitude for self-control, when you get that nudge or you're expecting that email, we're just drawn to it, right? We crave some of those things sometimes. And so there have to be boundaries around it so that those things are off the table and those 7 minutes can pass and fruitful conversation can occur. So 2 that I've heard parents use a lot, I think are important. One is just to make car time conversation time. And, maybe a small step is not even to do it every single trip, but maybe it's 1 day a week or a certain kind of commute to and from school where phones are just away. They're not a part of the drive. And maybe in some of those moments you sit in quiet and some of those you don't. I actually don't get to do this a lot with my kids because my wife and I share a car. And so most of my driving time is with our family as a whole. But this week I found myself in my car with my oldest son for about an hour and a half. And it was really neat. It was really fun just to put this into practice myself and to just let it be quiet. And he's been thinking about some bigger things and navigating new situations. And so it was just amazing the ways that we would be in one part of a conversation that was pretty deep, a concern that he had, and then navigate away from it, and then eventually after some more silence back to it again. And I could just see, even there, his little mind processing that at different times and in different ways. And there's just something about the car where you just know when that adult is driving, they're available for conversation. And so I think it can be a powerful place. A second is to fill the center of your home with things that reward skill and active engagement. Years ago, and I probably wasn't around to lament this, but people lamented that the TV was the center of the living room. And that was the kind of home I grew up in. I mean, I was watching TV for hours each day as a kid. But now it's not just the TV, right? It's that there could be 4, 5, 6 different screens that play in our living room at once, while watching certain shows has now become boring. And a lot of us like to watch a show while we scroll on our phone or while we're texting or text or talk about what we're watching with somebody on our phones instead of being present with the people that we're with. And so just thinking about things like puzzles and board games and pianos and sewing tables and arts and craft supplies, just activities that will help your entire family slow down and give you moments just to be present with one another and to connect with one another. And then the last is an important one, I think, as well, to wake up before your devices and to send them to bed before you sleep. And I've talked to a lot of parents that are pretty hard and fast about this rule, that their kids check in their device, maybe to them in their room, and they have the charging station there, at whatever time, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, and they go to bed on their own and just have an opportunity to go to bed without their phone and to wake up without their phone. And I think that's another wonderful practice to have. If you're looking for more resources, and I'm sure you're going to love just some more of the practicality that you'll find from Donna Dunn's talk. But if you're looking for another resource with more practical suggestions about navigating tech in the home, I'd really encourage you to check out The TechWise Family by Andy Crouch. That's another book I've just really liked. But again, I just say start small, try to be consistent. And I think our kids respond well when we can be consistent. And I think on the flip side of that, when we start expressing our values in certain ways, but then we don't follow through, that can have a negative effect as well. So I just want to finish that by saying that while COVID has presented some challenges, I wanted to share one quick blessing that I found in my life from it in this community at Bear Creek, and it's carpool, actually. So with the circumstances, kids aren't just walking freely into the building. They step in and we check their apps. Obviously, if you're a family here, you know this before they walk in, and then when parents come through the carpool line on their way to pick them up, we send them down so they can stay socially distanced and hop in their car. And I just want to say, I've read a lot of books about Generation Z and some of these effects of technology on kids, and I just am amazed every day that students as old as 8th grade, 13, 14-year-olds to as young as 5th graders, 10, 11 years old, pop out of the car at 7:45, 8 o'clock in the morning and look me in the eyes and say, "Good morning, Mr. Pettit, how are you?" And I'm just constantly encouraged by that every day, and I'm constantly impressed by the community that we have here and the kids that we have here. It's near and dear to me. So again, if you are one of those parents who's here, and probably most of you are, I just want to thank you for raising such wonderful children and to taking stock into some of these things that I shared tonight. So thank you all for giving me your attention tonight. I hope I've given you some food for thought, and I really appreciate your time together.
Thank you so much, Nathan. I appreciate it. I was taking some notes. There's so many good reminders, not just for teenagers, but also for us as adults as well. So I appreciate all of the reading and wisdom and thinking you've done on this topic. Our next speaker, as Nathan mentioned, is Donna Dunn, and I'll just introduce her briefly to you all. Donna is a biology teacher at Bear Creek with an affinity for all things small. Her degrees are in microbiology and molecular biology. For a number of years, she researched viral encephalitis at Colorado State University in cooperation with the Center for Disease Control's Vector-Borne Viral Diseases Division in Fort Collins, Colorado. Upon moving to Seattle, Donna was eventually called to teach at Bear Creek in 1997. At that time, the school was K through 9, and Donna taught grade 8 earth science and grade 9 physical science. As the students grew older, she grew with them, teaching chemistry to grade 10, and at last finding permanence with the juniors, teaching her true love, biology. Throughout her tenure at Bear Creek, Donna has served in many areas as needed, including teaching senior capstone, classical rhetoric, health, anatomy and physiology, as well as developing the upper school community service and mission programs. She is also a loving mother and grandmother, and we are thrilled to be able to spend time with her this evening, sharing her insights on communication. So Donna, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Katie. So kind, and thanks, Nathan, too. I really enjoyed hearing stories about you as a 5-year-old. And now your oldest, almost 5, so very fun. I'd like to follow up Nathan's stellar talk with some practical keys to communicating with teenagers. I never thought I'd have much to offer in this department. I've always been a science geek. And my first occupational love, as Katie mentioned, was viruses and disease processes. I fell into teaching just about the time my oldest child became a teen, and I was swept into the marvelous stream that is Bear Creek with a lively and really funny group of 8th grade earth science students. My friend Sherry Brown, you may know her, Sherry and I started teaching together, and she began that year by getting to know her students, by talking with them and playing icebreaker games. I walked in and lectured from bell to bell on Earth's atmosphere and then dumped a load of homework on the kids. At the end of the week, I was obnoxious enough to ask Sherry why she was wasting time with warm-up activities. Clearly, I had a lot to learn. Fast forward 24 years, and here are just a few of the things I've learned from my own 4 children and the 1,000+ teenagers I've been privileged to host in my classrooms. The adolescent years transition a child to adulthood, and I am here to testify it's not always a smooth ride. In our biology classroom, we watch wildlife cameras, nature cams, zoo cams, the latest are spy cams, which are really cool, and eagle cams are a frequent favorite. Here you see a juvenile eagle with a parent eagle. The juvenile eagle is noisy and a bit awkward. It has a large wingspan. It's not really sure how to wield those wings yet. As an eagle prepares to fledge or exit the nest, mom and dad eagle can get elbowed and bumped around a bit. But keep the end in mind. There aren't many things as beautiful as an eagle in flight. Here is our friend Haliaeetus leucocephalus, wingspan of 2 meters, socially distanced wingtips. She's glorious. When it comes to parenting adolescents, my friend Arlen Lawrence points out in her book, Parenting for the Launch, we're not launching kites with strings we hold on to, strings we control. Rather, we're launching eagles to soar. And what is your role in the launching years? Well, it's a dynamic one in which you shift from director to facilitator, from professor to tutor, from chief operating officer to resource consultant. There will be 1,000+ conversations in the launching years. Some will be short, possibly monosyllabic exchanges, and others will be deep and important. To flourish communication, I've sorted through 5 keys that have been helpful to me as both a teacher and a parent. The first key is approachability. Our communication style as parents is shaped by our own history and also by current habits we've formed. To break out of my own historically unhelpful, often defensive patterns, I was motivated by a desire to understand my child or to understand my students. If you truly value the person over the performance, then you'll want to get to know this teenage person better. And not just for yourself, but for your teenager as well. One of your goals in getting to know them is to facilitate their own self-discovery. Most of this you do by listening and by asking a few well thought out questions. My motto is drip, don't pour. Plant a few seeds at a time, not the whole entire garden. And no matter what your teenager says to you, listen with calm. Do not freak out. Make your face calm. Raise neither 1 nor 2 eyebrows. Students have taught me there are 2 main ways to freak out. There's the negative, I can't believe you just did that, freak out. And then there's the positive freak out. Too much enthusiasm and interest can send a teenager fleeing back to their room. This is something I do whenever alumni return to school for a visit. I'll see them at the far distant end of the hall and I'll start jumping up and down, get all excited. They'll turn and head the other direction. In one of my biology classes some years ago, we were getting ready to start a unit on human reproduction. I told the class that in my regular update to parents, I would be letting them know that we were studying sex in this next unit. And one of the girls in my class began begging me, pleading with me not to say anything to the parents because her mom would then ask her questions or grill her every night. I thought I had a brilliant idea. I thought I could ask the parents to wait for their teen to initiate the conversation. But this girl said, no, that won't work. Because then wherever we go, she'll follow me around with hopeful eyes. Don't let them see your desperation. Approachability is fostered by calm. Our second key is adaptability. Understanding our children as they go through adolescence is a fluid process. For example, my husband noticed that as our kids went through middle school, they all had something he called a justice gene. They knew exactly what was fair and unfair. The justice gene is fairly attributable to middle schoolers. It's why in a classical education we emphasize the dialectic at this age. There are lots of lively conversations to be had by proposing scenarios and then asking students, what do you think? As students move into high school, they tend to grow into more nuanced perspectives, and it's our privilege and necessity to grow with them. Dr. Jeff Gephardt, our previous dean, recommended a book to me called Growing With. I love the opening prayer. I'd like to read it. It says, Jesus, our kids are growing up and we are growing older. These truths weigh heavily on us, some days more than others. There are moments when it feels like we're growing together and other times when we fear we're growing apart. By your grace, please grant us faith to trust you with our kids, as well as courage to grow with them through our parenting. Spark in us a more expansive vision for this journey, a vision not only about who they might become, but also who we might become. Amen. They are becoming, and you are not done becoming either. For a few years, I taught classical rhetoric and learned about this concept called kairos, the right or appropriate time to say the right or appropriate thing. Most often, you don't get to choose when your teen will open up. It's not schedulable. So be adaptable. If they're in a quiet mood, either be quiet with them or use a neutral conversation starter and see where it goes. When they choose to open up, you have a couple of options depending on the teenager and the context. You can drop what you're doing and let them be your sole focus. And I highly recommend this. Or keep doing what you're doing. It might make them feel more comfortable if you keep working. But slow down the tempo of your work and listen wholeheartedly to your teen. And when I say keep working, I'm thinking more of things like folding laundry or dishes, not working on your laptop or your phone. Have you ever approached somebody for conversation while they're on their laptop and they close it and look at you? It's a very satisfying, powerful feeling. So just to build on what Nathan said, it is better if you can give your teen all of your focus and be fully present. Kairos is a window of time. We wait for it and then we seize the opportunity. Our next key is hospitality, and this picture is a little bit poignant. I know COVID has rained on that parade of gathering together, but there will come a time again. We can't always wait for our children to open up. It could be a long wait. Can we set the scene instead to foster communication? A summer ago for fun, I read Priya Parker's The Art of Gathering, and I noticed some parallels between hosting and parenting. Early in the book, Parker warns against the culturally embedded desire to be a chill host. Sometimes you have to nudge your guests out of their comfort zone, and you do this, she posits, as a representative of their future happy selves. This is true for parenting teens as well. Connection will flourish them, but it doesn't happen on its own. It requires an occasional nudge. So plan for the kinds of connections you want to create and put effort into the setting. Add a little surprise or mystery to the ordinary meals and family time. SARS-CoV-2 has made this a little tougher. It's not like you can hop out and try a new restaurant, but there are creative ways to prepare Saturday brunch together or pack and enjoy a winter car picnic in the rain. Or just tote a confetti cannon in your messenger bag to shower your teen when you pick them up on a Friday afternoon after school. It's the weekend. Celebrate. Your willingness to be lighthearted or even ridiculous will open your teen's heart and engage them a little more. Another hosting suggestion from Parker is to act in your role as a generous authority. And I really loved that phrase, generous authority. Be generous to your offspring with food, of course, and compliments. Be generous with gratitude and with grace. You're still the parent, and there are still rules. But treat your teen incrementally, increasingly as adults. Invite them into decision making. Invite them into planning events that impact them. Some of my best conversations with my own children and some of their best memories have revolved around special events they helped plan and host. Ask your teen to share ideas with you. I know our students, they are themselves hospitable, gracious people. During these COVID days, I've watched our students creatively serve others, the highest form of hospitality, with sensitivity and courage. The fourth key is availability. All the things I'm advocating take time and energy, and who has that really? We have busy jobs and other family members with needs, stuff to care for. The last thing I want tonight is to weigh you down with a list of unattainables and a load of guilt. As Nathan mentioned, we, your kids' teachers, see how hard you work and what amazing children you're raising. Your offspring are terrific people. I still chuckle every time I pass out a test in class. I hand out a test to students and they thank me. Thank you, Mrs. Dunn, for this test. Who says that? You're very polite children do. Your kids, especially in COVID, have been incredibly supportive with their teachers. They've been patient and forgiving and kind. So let me take this moment to say thank you to you for your teenagers. They're the reason I am still teaching. And I want to remind us that this is a judgment-free zone, right? We've not pandemic parented before, so we're in this together. In terms of availability, let's get back to this fourth key because there's a conversation to be had with regard to this. Ask your teen in the most open-minded, non-threatening way to rate you on your availability. They may say you're too available and ask you to please quit stalking them, or they may say they never have your full attention. Either way, ask how you can improve. Because despite the way it seems, adolescents need more than just quality time. Quantity matters. Studies are revealing that in terms of eventual character and well-being of your adult children, your availability actually matters more in adolescence than it did in the grade school years. So loosen up your schedule. Whenever your teen asks you to do something with them, say yes. Yes to a trip to the DMV or yes to Safeway. You may already have experienced the positive effect of what we called windshield time on conversation, being side by side with your teen. And be available not just to your own teen, but to their friends as well. One day, one of our sons, then a freshman in high school, asked if we would drive him and his friend Brett to a new church in downtown Seattle. They have a busy life, a busy schedule, and didn't necessarily want to take the time and effort. But my husband did it, and he had a great time talking with both boys on the trip there. And we've never regretted the spiritual growth that came out of the day for both those young men. Your teen's friends are cool and interesting people, and surprisingly may actually want to talk to you, even if your own teen does not. Good conversations await. This picture on this slide is from the show This Is Us, you may know it, and here the dad, Randall, meets his daughter's friend Malik. Randall's conversation with Malik, Randall's trying very hard, but it's painfully awkward. I just encourage us to lean in to the awkward. It's part of our job description, so don't be shy. Speaking of awkward, let's pause the keys for a minute and talk about conflict. Excuse me for a moment. Parenting's a lifelong relationship, and because it involves at least two humans, there will inevitably be conflict. Indeed, it's our parenting responsibility to lovingly, humbly confront our teen as needed. It's hard, but hard conversations can have a payoff. They can serve love, promote connection, and deepen relationship. How do you approach having a problem-solving conversation with your teen? Let's start with the virtue of clarity. Back in those classical rhetoric days, I prepped by reading as much Aristotle as I could. He has a work called Rhetoric that was my main focus. But did you know that Aristotle wrote a lot of biology too? He's considered the father of zoology. Amazing dude. In his work Rhetoric, Aristotle writes of one communication virtue above the rest, and that's clarity. Clarity is pivotal to conflict resolution. When you want to communicate a problem with your teen with the goal of finding a solution, it helps to be clear about three things. First, the nature of the problem. Make the issue as understandable as possible to your teen. Next, the effects of the problem. What it is doing to you and to your relationship. And finally, be clear about the desire for change. What would you like to see that will help solve the problem? These suggestions come from a book by Henry Cloud and John Townsend called How to Have That Difficult Conversation. And it's full of practical tips and examples. I highly recommend it. But clarity is not everything. We can be crystal clear laying out a problem and yet at the same time offensive or wounding to our children, which is why we're going to spend a minute with some wisdom from Solomon. Many of us are familiar with Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, the verses that begin, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Those are really good parenting verses. But I love the two verses prior as well, which say, do not let mercy and truth leave you. Bind them around your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart. So you will find favor and good high regard in the sight of God and teenagers. Well, it says all people. Mercy and truth. The Hebrew word for mercy here is one of my favorite in all of language. I will slaughter the pronunciation because it has a guttural in it. It's something like chesed. And it means a covenantal commitment. It's variously translated love, mercy, kindness, loving kindness, and steadfast love. Steadfast love and truth. When you're frustrated with your kid, and we all get there, it's so important to loosen those feelings of frustration and approach the problem-solving conversation from a loving, humble posture. And here are two tips that help me do that with my own children. First, I remind myself that it's my responsibility to enjoy my children. It's our job to enjoy our kids. When your teenager is hard, it's more important than ever to find something, even a small thing, that you enjoy about them. And then remind yourself and remind them what you enjoy about them. Secondly, pray and ask God to show you something about your teenager that you've never seen before. More often than not, you'll gain a fresh perspective, and always you will gain a more open, loving heart toward them. Begin your conversation there. So I've asked us to think about being approachable, adaptable, hospitable, and available. And I've saved the last key, the best key for last, and I've just called it home. Research shows that despite the competition, you, the parent, are still the primary voice in your adolescent's life. That's amazing because cultural voices seem relentlessly present and influential and turbulent. If we could listen into your home, what voice would we hear? Make your goal to fill your home with warmth. How do we define warmth? As someone who's frequently cold, I'd say don't forget physical warmth. Check your thermostat and don't be stingy with it. And we can agree that Christmas brings some warmth into our home, good smells, lights, and music, and above all, laughter. If you ask any of my 4 kids the secret to a good dinner table conversation, they will say laughter. And if you ask any of my 3 sons the secret, they will say Jocelyn, their oldest sister, because she's the comedian in the family. When we adopted our youngest child, he was 4 years old and didn't speak English, but he had the most infectious giggle, and some dinners were entirely all of us giggling back at him and at each other. When things got tense in our home, I don't know the number of times that laughter saved us. Warmth is also, in addition to laughter, warmth is grace-filled words. It's a hug here and there. It could be a bear hug competition. See who gives the best bear hugs in the family. It's 1 Corinthians 13, patience, kindness, perseverance, and unconditional acceptance. It's tough. This is tough some days. We're ordinary parents, sometimes superheroes, sometimes feet of clay. Do y'all know the children's book author Mo Willems? Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus is one of his books, and he has a whole series on Elephant and Piggy. He also has a lesser known work called Nanette's Baguette, in which most of the words rhyme with baguette. It's a magical book. Go home and read this book. This little girl, Nanette, is sent to the store to buy a baguette, but she eats it before she gets home. Afterward, Nanette, Mo Willems tells us, is beset with regret. But the wise mom says to her little girl, "The day's not over yet, Nanette. Let's reset." When you check the physical thermostat daily in your home, check the relationship one too. Are you speaking words of grace, truth, and love to your teenager? Are you filling your home with warmth and laughter? If not, each day brings new mercies. Let's reset. Which brings me to the end game. We live imperfect lives, and so do our kids, but we're in it for the long haul. Someday, adolescence will pass, your grown children will scatter, and you, my friends, will fret. But on a summer day when the sun is shining and the hydrangeas are blooming, they will come home again. You bet. Thank you.
Donna, what a fun photo Donna of you and your family. Thank you for sharing that. For those of you that have already asked questions in the chat, thank you so much. We're going to start going through some of those. If you have a question and have not asked it yet, then get to it. We'll try and get to as many of those as we can during this question and answer time. So feel free to ask a question now if you haven't yet. Nathan, this first question I'll send to you, and this parent is asking a little bit more specifically about a lot of these apps, social media apps. So you mentioned Snapchat, things like TikTok, and what research has been done on the impact of those on attention span and what that looks like as far as impact on teenagers.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I wish I had a lot of the research memorized, but I'd have to go pull a book off of my shelf to be as accurate as I would want to be, in a conversation like this. But I mean, the simple answer is that it has a lot of negative effects to our attention and to our ability to focus on one thing. Early on, research about multitasking was actually pretty positive. And there were a lot of people saying that when you're multitasking, you're actually accomplishing more than if you were unitasking. As far as what I've read, and maybe there are people out there who still say that's true, but as far as what I've read, that's pretty much been disbanded or dispelled as a myth. That actually unitasking, when we focus on one thing at one time, we're more productive, we're more creative, we're more efficient in everything that we do. So even if you have two things, if you do them separately and block out time, then that happens there. Another great book, if you that I mentioned Cal Newport and his digital minimalism book. But then he also has a book called Deep Work, where he gets into some of that and what it means to do deep work and to dig deeply into what you focus on. And then the last thing I'll just say real quick is an analogy that stuck with me from Nicholas Carr's The Shallows. And he talked about how like when you're reading a book, what you need for that information to really lodge itself well, and Donna Dunn probably could talk about this a lot better than me because I'm not a scientist, but it's lodged into your short-term memory, and then over time, when those things are solidified well, they work their way into your long-term memory. And what he said is you could think of it almost like a dripping faucet, just a steady drip drip, because when there's no noise and well, not noise as in like you couldn't listen to music, but you know what I mean, like the things that are seeking our attention, then that process of reading or studying is more fluid, and then they work their way into our long-term memory. But when other forms of media, or even there's been studies done about reading text on a screen with hyperlinks, that our brains have to make subconscious decisions every time we see something clickable about whether or not we would want to click onto that link. Even if you're not thinking that ad in the side about how to bake souffles looks interesting, you still have to decide not to click it or not to read what it says. And so as a result, your reading of that web page is not going to be as thorough and comprehensive into your long-term memory as you would want. That doesn't exactly answer the question, but it's related just as far as the way media intersects with memory and attention.
Thank you, Nathan. I think that's great. I think that's incredibly helpful, and a good to know. I didn't know that about all those micro decisions your brain is making when you're reading the web page. Makes me think about how I hyperlink in emails too. Donna, this next question I think is for you. And this parent was saying, you talk about sometimes you get full sentences from kids in your kids. Sometimes you get one-word responses. So this parent wants to know, when you're in a one-word response phase, how do you then build off of those one-word responses into a conversation? Or do you just let the one words sort of exist and move on?
Donna, you're muted. Sorry.
Thanks, Nathan. Sorry about that, everybody. I would say one idea to try is ask your kid. Tell them you would like to have occasional polysyllabic questions. Polysyllabics are delightful. If they're competitive, you can challenge them to use the most polysyllabics as possible. But seriously, I went to a conference in Boston once called Learning in the Brain, and Dr. Bob Brooks from Harvard was talking to a small group of teachers and administrators, and every time we would ask him, how do we do this with students question, he would say, ask the students, ask the students. And it was really annoying because we wanted an answer. But his point was that, teenagers have insights. And so I found, here's what happens when you ask them is maybe they don't have an answer either, but you've shown them that you value their answer. And so if you ask your teen, say, our conversations seem to be one-word conversations, and my goal for our family is to flourish conversation, and I would like us to have conversations of 5 sentences or more. I don't know, arbitrarily drawn number. How do you think we could achieve that? And I have watched with students and my own children, just that kind of softens and makes them open to it. And sometimes they don't give you an answer at all, but their behavior changes a little bit. So that might be a suggestion to help.
Thank you, Donna. That's fantastic advice. I love that. Nathan, I'll send this next question to you. It's about one of the concepts you were talking about, this idea of we are the product that you mentioned when an app is free. And this parent is wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on specifically what that means and the impact that that has on digital communication and on their teenager.
Yeah, definitely. And it's hard for me not to talk about this without sounding like an alarmist, but I have social media. I mean, I think if I truly believed that it was destroying anybody's life, I wouldn't have it myself, or would want to talk to my wife about whether or not we should eliminate it, though we do take breaks from time to time. So this concept, and this isn't necessarily like a documentary I go walking around and promoting or telling people about, but you can learn a little bit more about this concept in the documentary The Social Dilemma that Netflix developed. But there are a lot of engineers and developers who have basically talked about just why companies like Facebook and Instagram could make so much money, because we're not paying them, right, for their services. The people that are paying them are the advertisers. So when you're scrolling, on Instagram on your phone, or you're on Facebook's web platform, and you see advertisements in the side, people are paying a nice amount of money to have their advertisements there, and oftentimes they're going to be curtailed to your past research history or what you've Googled, because they want obviously you to buy their stuff, because that's why they exist as companies. So to get it in front of you, they need you to be on the app. So when those companies like Instagram and Facebook have data about how long people are on their apps and how long you're using their services, then that drives up the price of those advertisements. So our attention is directly linked to their profit. So that's why some people who like to say things in that kind of a nice way would say, actually, our attention is the product that's being sold, and we're there to be a part of it. But so what is free is only free in certain ways.
Thank you, Nathan. I think that's really helpful and insightful and important actually for us all to know and think about and recognize. Donna, this next question is from a parent that loves your confetti cannon idea, but says, if I did that, my kid would walk the other way. So this parent wants to know, how do you balance excitement without embarrassing your kid, so that you're opening communication versus making them never want to speak to you ever again?
So true. And we do embarrass our children frequently. And you don't want to surprise your children by transforming into this Tigger type, bouncy, creative, funny, fun parent if that's not the dynamic of your family. So maybe there's a little more gentle way to not embarrass them. Maybe do it after you get home. Confetti cannon in the privacy of your own home. But I'd also say don't be afraid to embarrass them, and then have a follow-up conversation about it. And maybe they could then articulate their embarrassment, and you could articulate your love or your joy and enjoyment in them, and your desire to make COVID, a little bit less flat. Last spring in COVID, I saw students really having a good time with their families. The kids were cooking more, they were talking more, having meals together, going on walks more. I'm not seeing that. Kids aren't expressing that same excitement about being in the home as much. And I think we need to kind of push back into to gathering a little bit. No, not gathering, just having more fun. Let's have more fun. And you can explain that to kids, right? It's time for us to have more fun. It's winter in a pandemic. and there's a lot of news stuff, and there's just a lot of families are going through hard things. And so you can let your family know that it's going to be your goal to have more fun.
I like that. That's a great goal to have. Donna, this next question is for you as well. And this parent wants to know, their teen often says, or they think their teen would say that they're in the too available category. And they said, the parent asked in the question, well, but I don't want to completely back off, so I don't know what's going on in my kid's life. So how do I balance respecting not wanting to be too available or too invested or grilling my kid while still being engaged and having open communication?
I honestly don't know the answer to balance. Balancing is so hard. With each unique teenager, it's a different set of parameters. So you got this. No, I won't leave you with that. But I will say my go-to is to go back to asking your kid what, explaining yourself to them, your goals for the relationship, letting them know that that you recognize that maybe they feel that you're overly involved, and ask them if there is one area you could step back in, what would that be? Or one little baby step of stepping back, how could you do that? And then ask them what might be an area that that you're missing. My students, I asked one class, I told one group of students on Tuesday that I was going to be talking with parents tonight, and I said, what do you want them to know? And a couple of them said, stop asking me the same questions that you always ask. I have other interests besides school. Don't ask me about my day at school. So maybe that might be, what's an area maybe that you're missing out on that you could step into, and what's an area you could step back from?
That's great advice. Thank you, Donna. And I like that idea of, returning to the ask your kid. I think that's great advice too. As we wrap up on our time, I think we'll ask this one last question here, maybe one or two, if depending upon time. But Nathan, this question is for you, and this parent wants to know, specific to COVID, as there's so much increased screen time around school specifically, do you have any recommendations for creating that idea of solitude that you mentioned during the school day, or during that sort of pervasive screen time right now that kids are experiencing during the school atmosphere and school time?
Yeah, definitely. And I've thought many times how different things are in terms of even whether you're doing school at home or whether you're doing school in a building. The time that maybe exists between classes or between certain parts of the day can be much more quickly filled with things that are going on our screens. And because it's hard for us, right? I think it's something like the average American checks their phone every 6 minutes. And so there's something that's always drawing us back, and especially for a teenager, probably who hasn't looked at their phone in 50 minutes to an hour, there's that draw to see what they've missed, that fear of missing out, where we know that things have been going on and we're worried that we might be missing out on it. And so that's true. I mean, even when everybody's back at school, that when you walk out of maybe a classroom, we're more tempted to see what we've missed than maybe to take time to process what that lecture was about, or how that discussion went, or how when we said that thing, somebody had a face that looked sad or hurt or disinterested when we disagreed with them. So there's a lot, obviously, for us to process about our school day, about what we're learning and all the social interactions that are happening. So you probably already know that, which is why you asked that question. So I'm just restating the question again. I think there are a few different ways that come to mind. Some that might feel natural and some that might feel a little bit unnatural. Maybe one that might feel unnatural because of the time we're living in is to take a walk. You know, if there are 5 or even 10 minutes, being able to walk around the house or walk down to the end of the street and back, maybe something that you two could even do together as they're verbally processing, which could even be considered a form of solitude of just processing what's going on in their brains with you, you know, as a listening ear, is definitely one possibility. I think there's a lot of beauty even in eating. So finding a snack that they like, that they're engaged with, and just sitting down at the table without anything else around and being able to enjoy food. I think some of our best solitude is actually when we're doing something else that's occupying our bodies. So things like eating. Some of my best solitude is while I'm jogging in the morning, and just things that keep our bodies preoccupied. I mean, another huge one for me is driving, which obviously maybe doesn't apply to as many teens, but I can recall, you know, making some big life decisions, getting into my car, driving about 30 minutes and realizing I didn't even think about turning on the music because my mind was just racing that whole time. So finding things that keep our hands busy. And so a lot of that could be depending on what your kids are interested in, if it's or maybe they might find new interest because of COVID, like puzzles or whatever. I never considered myself a puzzle person, but we brought up a table from the garage a couple weeks ago. And once you get a couple pieces, you get really into it. So I don't know, try some new things too that can keep your hands busy. But I think that's one piece of advice I would give, is just find something to do while that solitude is happening.
I love that, Nathan. Those are great suggestions. I'm not sure this would be very good during the school day, but one of you mentioned baking, and I think it's been so fun. I've heard that a lot from families that I've been connecting with, that their kids and the parents too have gotten into baking and trying different recipes. So I think that's fantastic. Well, we're coming up here on time, so I'm just going to wrap us up today. I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us in this virtual audience, and I certainly want to thank Nathan and Donna. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure if we were in person, there would be a lot of loud applause right now. And I really appreciate all of your wisdom and sharing with us all about how to navigate communication and technology, particularly during this pandemic, where, like I said at the beginning, it's at the forefront of our minds. I also want to acknowledge that I know we have some prospective families on this call, as well as families outside of the Bear Creek community. So if you are interested in learning more about the Bear Creek School, you are welcome to reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat box, and you can reach out, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you about Bear Creek and also what the school is doing during COVID. I know that's been a big question, so I can share a little bit about that in our Bear Creek Choice program as well. But thank you all for being with us tonight and taking part in our Tools for Success series, and have a wonderful evening and Happy New Year.